Hello, everyone. Welcome to the question and answer discussion round of Keith Barry's talk. I mentioned in the beginning of his talk that there was a Q&A tool while he was speaking that was not there, but it is there now. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A tool that you will find at the bottom in the menu bar of this session. And right now I invite Keith to join me here on stage so that we can take the first questions. Keith. Hi there.
Hello.
So we have participants coming in. The Q&A section is open. So thank you for this interesting talk and also for framing it theoretically, like coming in from culture, identity, and relations, and then also sharing your very personal experiences with these times. So it was very interesting to listen to, and I'm pretty sure that there are a few questions. Let's see, quite a few people that are also working with narratives and small stories. So we'll see where the questions will go. Have you continued with your autoethnographic work since the talk?
I have, because we continue to live in it.
Yes.
Right. It's like I said in the talk. It's the difficulty is that we're in it, right? And from one perspective, it's difficult to simultaneously live and analyze, and that's phenomenological perspective. But I sure do. I'm taking notes, field notes. Listening more intently now, now that maybe we seem to be beginning to emerge, whatever that looks like, here and around the world, safety-wise. I feel like I'm able to have a little bit of distance from it. So it's definitely I'm workshopping these ideas, and it's definitely a work in progress.
Yeah. I was wondering, since we had a few talks on like COVID-19 and how people like sort of try to also make sense of it scientifically, whether you're also taking pictures and how like sort of visual data, whether you include that in your autoethnography as well, and if so, how?
Oh, great question. Yeah, I will do that more and more, remembering that autoethnography typically, and hopefully if it's done well, is also ethnography, right? And the external move. I haven't been out that much. And so my field work in that regard is limited to screen pictures, capturing screen pictures of Twitter messages, Instagram pictures, and Facebook messages. A little bit of lurking, involved in that, but it's for me, the relational approach requires us to look at the everyday, mundane, ongoing tasks of communication, and so it's given me a nice opportunity to kind of start to build a kind of an inventory of pictures.
Yeah, for me, it's also interesting while we're waiting also to dive in and out. Like I was walking to the bakery with my daughter this morning and I forgot my mask because it seemed like a normal day. And then we turned around the corner and I saw the line with 2 meters in between the people and everyone was wearing masks. So we turned around and got those at home. But for like a short period of time, like it was normal. Like it was sort of like it was not forgotten, of course, but it was not in the foreground. So that was interesting to sort of, by this very vivid picture, to just like be zoomed back into our current times. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And kind of a momentary forgetting.
Yeah, exactly. Momentary forgetting. That's pretty much it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's some of it I'd love to forget significantly, but
yeah.
I'm grateful to be living.
Sorry. We do have the first question from Michael Bamberg. He says, thanks, Keith. Interesting and inspiring. I have 2 questions. Here's the simple one. How do you see the difference between teaching and doing therapy on one hand and learning and healing on the other? For example, how do we construct ourselves and our students differently along those dimensions? So teaching and doing therapy on the one hand and learning and healing on the other.
Oh, goodness, that's wonderful. And I love your work, Michael, by the way. Yeah, oh, goodness. So for me, So they're distinct practices, for sure. And they need to be distinct practices, teaching and doing therapy. I'm not a licensed psychotherapist. I don't have that background, even though so many of my research and teaching interests are deep into issues of personhood, wellness, identity, and other relational phenomena for me. So I don't have to remind myself much anymore of that, but I did it first in times of crisis related to teaching, because it'd be very tempting to look at that role as one of therapy. But that being said, much like certain research modalities like autoethnography, reflexive life writing, narrative, there are therapeutic dimensions to the teaching and learning that very much are real. I find to be appropriate and safe, and usually those are the types of things that I think about in hindsight. I think of Mark Freeman's book on hindsight and narrative, like looking backwards. Micah, can you repeat the second strand of Michael's question?
So it was like the first one, how do you see the difference between teaching, doing, and then, for example, how do we construct ourselves and our students differently along those dimensions?
Yeah. Oh gosh. I don't, how do you interpret that second question? I don't know if I fully understand it.
You know what? Maybe we can bring Michael on stage so that he can like elaborate on that question a little bit more, because he said there's also a second one in the pipeline. So maybe if that
maybe we can come back.
Yes. While Morten and the background is figuring that out, I do have another question. You mentioned Trump's failed communication in the US as concerns the US. And the question is, how would you have communicated with US people about the crisis?
Gosh, this could take the whole conference, but I'll keep it. I'll keep it to a minute or so, right? Trump and I have very different historical backgrounds. So by nature of our backgrounds, just the overall our comportment would be very different. But in terms of communication, kind of the question also seems to want to know, like, what is effective communication in this moment? Communicating with clarity, right? Helping citizens understand what the problem is, what's at stake. The problem is, and I don't mean to be mean, but I don't think he understands what it means. So how can you communicate effectively when you don't have that understanding? Precision is another key piece with communication. Specificity, being specific, being particular. There's very little, to me, room for ad hominem attack, personal character attack in any communication, let alone the sitting president. And so it kind of goes without saying that his antics on Twitter and just real explicit, unapologetic antics of maligning people and demeaning them are not pro-social behaviors. They're not effective communication behaviors. And so in kind of also in a bigger picture, I believe I mentioned it in my talk, but much of the communication field is rooted in the concept of uncertainty, right? The unknown. And the extant research literature really, at least in interpersonal and relational communication, my area, and intercultural communication, talks about the ways in which the fundamental dis-ease, uneasiness that people have with uncertainty, and communication becomes the process of managing uncertainty. The theory from the 70s from Berger is uncertainty reduction theory, right? Later became uncertainty management. It was very big and is very big in health communication, right? How do we reduce uncertainty? And so a good president communicates effectively by putting his people, in this case, his people at ease, and trying to manage that uncertainty, knowing how scared people are.
I think that is a good good statement to deal with. And I think we could definitely go on with this discussion. What should be improved? There are many points that could. I think
Sure.
Michael is with us at the moment. So maybe Michael, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Hello?
can.
Okay, thank
Hi, Michael.
Now we cannot hear you anymore. Just a second. We just could hear you. And the question was whether you can clarify on what you meant with the second part of your question.
Yeah, okay. The second part of the question is a little bit different because, Keith, you put in a lot of background into your setup, into the first part. And it looks to me as if you want to marry ethnomethods on the one hand with phenomenology on the other, and then place yourself in the middle with autoethnography. And I just wonder, because these are, they're all qualitative methods, so to speak, but I think they are very bad. They would be very bad bedfellows. You know, it's like having Art Bochner on the one end and ethnomethodologist
Garfinkel.
For instance, yeah, that would not be possible, but Manny Sheglov, let's take him, he's alive, you know, and I don't think you would, so we would be able to survive in the middle. So there is a conflict here, and I wonder how you manage to address that.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a way in which my research life, much like my life, is in the middle, you know, and navigating that space.
Yeah.
And that, in a way, is the reconciling work of a phenomenologist for me, I feel. I think as from a research kind of protocol standpoint, for me, it's about knowing that these multiple influences can be there. Typically, these make okay bedfellows, if not really productive and maybe exciting bedfellows.
Yeah.
But the idea that too much is too much, right?
Right.
And so for me, it's a matter of foreground, background, right? So for me, phenomenology is always in the background. I don't know a kind of an existence that way without that always there. But at times it comes to the foreground with particular practices, you know. And so I don't know if this is answering your question, but it's a way of kind of there's so much, you're right to point out, so much in the setup, right, and the framing of the piece. But for me, an actual project when it manifests would never have that much, which is too much, right? And so I think I would just name the project based on the particular method. I think, is that answering your question?
Yeah. Okay. If I can just, I mean, I find myself, and I see a lot of people struggling in the same kind of, and I use the flirting metaphor. I'm flirting with ethnomethods, but I'm not in love with them, so to speak. But
flirting? I like that.
Yeah, I knew you would.
Yeah, I love it.
But here, the issue of learning and healing, and you brought that up. You opened that door, which is an interesting one, because my students don't see a difference between teaching and therapy. And they also construct themselves as not just as students learning, but rather as being taken care for. And you know, I'm not sure whether this is a productive conflict. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's definitely a romantic perception of us as doing therapy as well, you know, of the craft of teaching. You know, the passion of teaching is very romantic, but it could also be dangerous, you know. I don't, your question takes me to the idea of a related question, like what are the selves that get constructed? What are the identities that get formed in that process? And indeed, that too, we're only just beginning to think about that, right? But it is in the time of COVID and responses, it's fascinating to me how much simple pedagogical choices, simple communication choices in one's teaching and learning can make a radical difference in how that process happens, right? And so very brief example, very brief, we're very brief, responses to going remote. remote teaching. I know some folks who were, long story short, were very strict and wanted to duplicate what they were doing on the ground to what they were doing remotely. And then I know folks on the other end, and it might not surprise you to know that I was there. I cared differently, and I had to let it all go. And I think the selves that get constructed there, both as a teacher and as students, like who we are and who we are to each other, really differ depending on that choice.
Maybe it's at this point, thank you, Michael. Maybe it's at this point, since you are so passionate about the topic, a good moment to go to the next question, because somebody's asking if you could expand a bit on your concept of compassionate communication, especially with regard to how this may imply humility among communicators, which calls for mutual learning from and with one another in order to be a sustainable grounds for collective action.
Oh, goodness, that's wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you for these questions. The concept of compassionate communication comes from the Buddhist Pema Chodron, which I mentioned in the talk and with that definition. And it is rooted in the fundamental notion that communication is always about interdependent parties. We are always overlapping, interdependent. We have mutual influence, and so the fact that is just a fundamental part of communication compels me to ask myself, how am I treating that person? Right? How are my words, explicit or unplanned, potentially affecting that person in terms of crisis, in terms of responding to crisis, and taking care of each other? And at the same time, you notice in that definition that Chodron nudges us to think about compassion towards ourselves, right? The assumption there is that that's often a forgotten piece in many communicators' kind of life worlds or everyday experience, that we think compassion is about others, but it might sound very cliche, but you can't be compassionate with others without being self-compassionate. And so it's this idea of a response to self and others that's loving, gentle, understanding, slowing down, that I think is an essential first step and an ongoing step in that collective action that our colleague asked about.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe this also connects to the next question, because it is about authenticity. So how do you think authenticity of speaker and agents impacts communication? Like, for example, how would have Barack Obama communicated in times of this crisis as compared to President Trump? And how do you see communication through the cultural lens? And maybe the second part is another question, but the first one would be like, how do you think authenticity impacts communication?
Yeah, that too, as we'll probably agree, is a loaded term, right? Authenticity. But so important. I see authenticity in short as sincerity. I've heard authenticity defined as an ability to be oneself and autonomous in the face of the influence of others, right? Being oneself, being one's own version of oneself. And I think it's essential, right? I think authenticity is essential in the notion of trust, right? And how we trust leaders to respond in terms of crisis. I personally, I want to interact. I want to be led by someone who is their own version of themselves, even if it's different than me, and even if politically it's different than me, as long as that political difference doesn't seek to harm others. And my goodness, I could write a book on the differences between Obama and Trump. And I have to believe that it's not just emotional, and it's not just passion and nostalgia. I think the United States would be in a very different place today. Our support system would be different. The whole unveiling of the response would be radically different. And Obama was imperfect, and is imperfect like us all, but it would be radically different because he's leader.
So maybe also American culture, how do you see communication through a cultural lens is the second part of the question.
Well, for me, culture is very much discursive, and it can be interactional, but I go to the media very quickly for this type of question. And inseparable from it is cable news in the USA, this massive capitalistic machine, that very much dictates, influences, even governs sometimes the reality that people know and don't know about COVID and other crises, right? And in the States, it's only getting more hectic in terms of this cultural saturation of messages that are out there. It makes it very difficult to discern truth and issues of safety and things like that. I'm looking forward to Ken Gergen's talk this week, and particularly his book Saturated Selves. Like, that's really kind of prophetic in 2000 when he did that updated version of the saturated self. And I think that issue of the multiphrenic self, like culture for me right now in the US is this almost like, if you will, a battering of messages, and it makes it very difficult to discern what's true or not. Did I answer that question for you?
I think otherwise, I think we the person is more than invited to add on and like pose another question via the Q&A tool. We do have another one that is also about the US media. So do you think that the US media has played its role as concerns COVID-19? Has it been effective in your opinion?
The 2016 election left me a little disturbed about the media. I should preface with that. The media, I feel like the media duped citizens in the United States of what the reality was. And so I wanted to say that I come to that question and that experience with that background. And it is to say that I limit the type of media that I consume to print, because the storytelling on cable news is ridiculous, to say the very least, disturbing at the other end. Have they done their job though? I think so. I think I think this is all tied to the 2020 election, right? It's all overlapping. And I think more people are pushing back against Trump, questioning the demonstrated lies. I think it was 16,000 since he took office. And more we're seeing that. We're also seeing that work, and there's a gendered piece to it, right? His speeches demonstrated a misogyny that is out the door, right? And my favorite part of the response and the effective response are female or women reporters who will not take his first response, and challenge him and poke away at the misogyny. And I've really appreciated. So that's where I go, especially in terms of who's been effective. That's staying on it, and the gender piece.
So I think we have no more questions, but also the media, maybe to conclude this session, and thank you for the talk and the discussion, is also that there are not only the US media, but other sources of information available to people. And so we're using one right now. And I think with technology that the number of ways one can inform oneself has risen, and sort of it has gotten more diverse. And we're sort of adding here to that diversity, and we're doing so even more in the next few days. So you're invited to join the other keynotes and panel discussions. At this point, thank you very much, Keith, for joining us here in the discussion and answering the questions. The audience is more than invited to join us on Slack if there are any more questions. And I'm sure if questions come up in the next few days that you would like to post, Keith is available via email also, if there's anything that you would like to have answered. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity, and great to be with everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.